Ko waio, ko Te Āti Awa, ko Taranaki te iwi, ko Joshua Hitchcock, aho. For the past 15 years, I've worked in and for Māori businesses around Aotearoa. As a commentator on Māori issues, I have a deep interest in how Māori businesses operate and how Māori contribute to and are impacted by the New Zealand economy. This documentary takes a look into the Māori economy to see how it works, what drives it, and what makes it, and the businesses who operate within it, different from the wider New Zealand economy. So I welcome you to this insight into a fascinating and growing part of the Aotearoa New Zealand economy. If you were to consider the entire settled history of this land, it has only been the very short contemporary period, from the 1850s through to today, that Māori have not been the driving force behind the economy of these islands. The history of our economy starts on the day Kupe arrived on these shores. Our oral histories are rich with the stories of trade between hapu around the motu. Trading routes were established throughout both islands, and trade between Te Iko and Maui and Te Pounamu took place. Following contact with Europeans, trade by hapu was expanded internationally, first with the sealers and whalers, and then with the settlements in Australia. Wheat and flour were the primary commodities traded, and it wasn't long before Māori controlled coastal shipping and owned ships to transport goods to Australia.
I think the early settlers recognised that Māori were helping everybody. They were not only feeding the new arrivals, the new immigrant arrivals, but they were also contributing very strongly. By the 1850s, we know that Māori were contributing more to the overall coffers, if you like, economy of the country.
A lot of the business is based around trading in terms of seals and whales. But you certainly have other kinds of trade happening in terms of whatever kind of European technologies might be coming. And so those interactions were characterized by mutual benefit. Sealers and whalers would benefit in terms of their own business and having access to the resources that they were looking after, seals and whales.
Māori had been very entrepreneurial and keen to take advantage of trading opportunities ever since first contact with Europeans. Māori recognised very early that wheat and flour were the basis of the European diet, and that was recognised very early in around about 1812, 1813 by a rangatira from the Bay of Islands called Ruatara, who spent time in Sydney. He realised that it was a staple food there of the settlers in Australia, and he recognised that even though there were no settlers in New Zealand at that stage, there was an export market possible to New South Wales. The period from 1840, when the treaty was signed, through to 1860 was a very important era in New Zealand history, both for Māori and for Pākehā. The arrival of settlers, families coming from Europe, particularly Britain, to live here opened up a whole new market, because at that stage Australia wasn't producing its own wheat crops.
And that only increased after 1840. We were growing food and selling food specifically for the first wave of Europeans that were coming here. Like most whānau and hapu around the country, we've always been commercial, we've always been in commerce.
And so over those first 2-3 decades, the Māori community families here taught the Pākehā settlers how to survive in the land of Aotearoa.
The case of New Zealand especially, the settlers were largely urban people who were not used to having to grow their own food. They weren't farmers typically, so they were reliant very much on Māori horticultural produce and wheat.
And because there's massive amounts of trade happening. You know, fish are being traded into Port Jackson in Australia. There are really prominent leaders, ship owners, making these massive amounts of trade.
So water-based transport was key. And we know that by 1852, Māori were recognised as dominating the coastal trade industry.
They had the coastal shipping logistics, they had the flour mills, so basically they were the economy.
What happened next is a story of economic sabotage by the colonial government in New Zealand. While the Australian gold rush that had spurred on economic activity in New Zealand was collapsing, Māori faced an even bigger threat, an empire hungry for land and resources that had finally started to outnumber Māori through settlement.
From about 1857, settler government became effective. Prior to that, New Zealand had been ruled from London by the Colonial Office in London. Now, the local settlers had control of government. They were the ones who had the vote, because in order to have the franchise, you had to own land individually.
They built their system, including merchants, farmers, all the trades, and they shifted the economy from the tangata whenua effectively into their control.
And of course, Māori land was still largely communally owned at that stage. So Māori no longer had a say in the running of the government. The settlers ruled the roost, and of course they pushed their own interests to Māori disadvantage.
So what's the effect on the Māori economy of these kind of depredations? Is just massive. I mean, you need land in a post-treaty situation to develop your economic capability. And so the effect on this is a grinding poverty.
Our people are impoverished. We've got significant mortality from disease. Many of our people couldn't sustain themselves across the tauhī, and they moved away to other potential opportunity.
And so I think the effects on the economy are just enormous. And what you see is a redistribution of wealth.
We were a vibrant, prosperous, essential part of this community, impoverished, destitute, no housing, illness, disease, no opportunity. You can't get much lower than that.
The alienation of Māori from their traditional property rights and homes was absolutely brutal. For a long time, as we all know, colonisation stripped Māori of a lot of core assets, land, access to capital. When you have lost control over being able to make decisions with resources, or when you've lost access to the way in how you want to live and behave and operate in kaitiaki fashions, it is debilitating. And that's what we saw through the Māori population.
And landlessness, I mean, in any context in the world, leads to massive social, economic, cultural, and political deficits. And so what you have is essentially generations fighting, using the limited resources that they have to obtain some redress. So first of all, you have all your money flowing into that kind of issue. On top of that, you've got the effects of landlessness. You used to have a large domain over which to gather your resources, gather your food for trade, right?
So the place couldn't sustain the people. Most went. And it was the absence of people on the land that always shaped my thinking, because our aunties and cousins, they were scattered to the four winds.
By the time recognition of this was starting to get purchased, I would say, in downtown Wellington in the early 1900s and 1920s, the economy had moved on, and by that stage, you know, there were world wars being fought, there was urbanisation happening, and so a lot of the traditional land and traditional activities that Māori were involved in were no longer where the jobs were. And so it was kind of yet another wave of not only losing your initial starting place, but then also having to move on and try to catch up. And that's where we've seen long-term deficits.
You either continue to spiral down, or you set about it in a strategy to come out of that and improve your life and your people's life.
We would, over the course of the past century, develop our own strategies to rebuilding our place in the economy. Every good strategy is built on a foundation of core values. These values, such as kaitiakitanga, manakitanga, and whanaungatanga, underpin Te Ao Māori, and more Māori businesses are operating in accordance with these values. In the next episode, we will explore these values in more detail, and importantly, discuss how Māori businesses are putting these values into practice.